An Arab millionaire took his receptionist to a gala dinner, expecting only her silent presence. But to everyone's surprise, she presented bold ideas about ethics and innovation. Her comments shocked the investors and challenged the CEO's authority. Sarah Bennett adjusted her simple black blazer as she sat behind the pristine reception desk of Al Rahman International Holdings. The massive lobby, with its marble floors and golden accents, perfectly embodied the company's status as one of the Middle East's most powerful conglomerates. For 3 years, she had watched countless executives and dignitaries pass through these doors, always maintaining her professional smile and quiet efficiency. This morning, however, felt different. The usual calm of the early hours was disrupted by an unusual flurry of activity. Executive assistants rushed past her desk, their faces tense with worry. Through the whispered conversations she overheard, Sarah learned that several major investors had threatened to withdraw their support following rumors of ethical misconduct within the company. Sarah's attention was drawn to the elegant elevator doors as they opened to reveal Karim Al-Rahman, the company's CEO. His tall figure commanded attention, dressed impeccably in a tailored charcoal suit that emphasized his broad shoulders. His expression, usually stern and unreadable, showed signs of strain around his eyes. To her surprise, instead of heading straight to his office as usual, Karim approached her desk. Sarah straightened in her chair, trying to maintain her composure under his intense gaze. "Miss Bennett," his deep voice carried a slight accent, "I need to speak with you in my office immediately." Following him into his corner office on the top floor, Sarah couldn't help but marvel at the panoramic views of the city skyline. The space was minimalist yet luxurious, with modern artwork adorning the walls and a massive desk crafted from dark wood. "Miss Bennett, I find myself in an unusual situation," Karim began, his fingers drumming lightly on his desk. "Tonight, there is a crucial investors' gala dinner. My usual companion for such events is unavailable, and protocol demands I bring someone. You will accompany me." Sarah blinked, certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry, sir, but I'm just a receptionist. Surely there are more qualified—" "This is not a request, Miss Bennett," he interrupted, his tone brooking no argument. "You have been here long enough to understand our basic protocols. You are presentable, discreet, and capable of maintaining a professional demeanor. That is all I require." He handed her an envelope containing details about the event. "The company car will pick you up at 7 p.m. sharp. Wear something appropriate. You will not speak unless directly addressed, and even then keep your responses brief and non-committal. Is that clear?" Sarah nodded, still processing this unexpected turn of events. As she turned to leave, Karim added, "And Miss Bennett? This evening is crucial for the company's future. Do not disappoint me." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Sarah's mind raced with questions and concerns as she maintained her usual efficient manner at the reception desk. During her lunch break, she rushed to a nearby luxury boutique, grateful for her modest savings, as she purchased a midnight blue evening gown that she hoped would be suitable for such a high-profile event. As evening approached, Sarah stood in front of her apartment mirror, hardly recognizing herself. The gown fit perfectly, its subtle shimmer catching the light with every movement. She had styled her normally straight brown hair into elegant waves and applied makeup that enhanced her features while remaining tasteful and professional. The company car arrived precisely at 7 p.m. The driver, Hassan, whom she knew from his daily visits to the building, gave her an encouraging smile as he held the door open. Inside the car, Karim barely acknowledged her presence, his attention focused on his phone as they drove through the city's gleaming streets. The gala was being held at the prestigious Royal Gardens Hotel, its grand ballroom transformed into a showcase of luxury and power. As they entered together, Sarah felt the weight of curious glances from the assembled guests. She recognized many faces from business magazines and news reports. The room was filled with some of the most influential people in the international business world. Karim's hand rested lightly on her lower back as he guided her through the crowd, introducing her simply as Miss Bennett, without further explanation. Sarah maintained her composed silence as instructed, observing the subtle power plays and political maneuvering happening around her. Everything was going according to plan until she overheard a conversation between two investors discussing the company's recent ethical challenges. Their words were filled with skepticism, about Al Rahman International's commitment to corporate responsibility. "The company seems stuck in outdated practices," one investor remarked, his voice carrying across the elegant table setting. "In today's market, that's a recipe for disaster." Before she could stop herself, Sarah found herself responding, her voice clear and confident. "Actually, I believe Al Rahman International has the potential to become a leader in corporate responsibility. The foundation is already there. It just needs to be prioritized and properly implemented." The table fell silent. Sarah could feel Karim's gaze boring into her, but something compelled her to continue. For instance, the company's existing infrastructure could easily be adapted to support sustainable practices. It's not about completely changing course, but rather evolving to meet modern expectations while maintaining the core values that made the company successful. The investors leaned forward, intrigued. One of them, a distinguished-looking woman named Victoria Chen, asked, "And how would you suggest implementing such changes?" Sarah could practically feel the temperature drop as Karim tensed beside her, but she pressed on, drawing from her observations over the years. "Through a gradual but comprehensive approach. Start with transparent reporting systems, establish clear ethical guidelines, and create accountability measures that align with international standards. The key is to view ethical practices not as obstacles, but as opportunities for innovation and growth." As she finished speaking, Sarah finally dared to look at Karim. His expression was unreadable, but there was a dangerous glint in his dark eyes that made her heart race. She had directly disobeyed his instructions, and judging by the tightness of his jaw, there would be consequences. However, the investors seemed energized by her comments. Victoria Chen, in particular, was nodding thoughtfully, her calculating gaze moving between Sarah and Karim. The conversation around the table had shifted, with guests now actively discussing the possibilities of ethical innovation within traditional business models. As the evening drew to a close, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something significant had changed. She had crossed a line, yes, but she had also spoken truths that needed to be heard. The question was, what price would she pay for her boldness? The ride back was silent, the tension between her and Karim almost palpable. As they pulled up to her apartment building, he finally spoke, his voice cold and controlled. "We will discuss your behavior tomorrow morning, Miss Bennett. Be in my office at 8 a.m. sharp." Sarah stepped out of the car, her heart heavy with the knowledge that her moment of courage might have just cost her the job she had worked so hard to maintain. Yet, as she watched the car disappear into the night, she couldn't bring herself to regret speaking up. Sometimes, she reflected, the right thing to do isn't always the safe choice. The next morning dawned grey and overcast, matching Sarah's apprehensive mood as she entered the Al Rahman International building. The security guard gave her his usual friendly nod, unaware that this might be her last day walking through these doors. The lobby, typically bustling with early morning activity, seemed unusually quiet, as if the building itself was holding its breath. At precisely 8 a.m., Sarah knocked on Karim's office door. His deep voice commanded her to enter, and she stepped into the familiar space, now feeling far more intimidating than it had yesterday. Karim stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to her, hands clasped behind him as he gazed out at the city below. "Do you understand what you did last night, Miss Bennett?" His voice was controlled, but she could detect an underlying current of anger. "You directly disobeyed my instructions and potentially compromised sensitive company matters." Sarah straightened her spine, gathering her courage. "I spoke the truth, Mr. Al Rahman. The investors were concerned about the company's future, and I offered a perspective that could help address those concerns." Karim turned to face her, his dark eyes intense. "You are a receptionist, Miss Bennett. Your role is to answer phones and direct visitors, not to advise on corporate strategy." He moved to his desk, picking up a folder. "Your services will no longer be required at Al Rahman International." Despite expecting this outcome, the words still hit Sarah like a physical blow. She had loved this job, not just for the stability it provided, but for the window it had given her into the world of international business. She had spent countless lunch breaks studying the company's operations, reading business journals, and learning about sustainable corporate practices. "I understand," she said, proud that her voice remained steady. "I'll collect my things and leave immediately." As she turned to go, a sharp knock on the door interrupted the moment. Victoria Chen, the investor from the previous night, strode in without waiting for a response. Her presence filled the room with an energy that even Karim seemed to respond to. "Mr. Al-Rahman, I hope I'm not interrupting," Victoria said, though her tone suggested she didn't care if she was. Her gaze fell on Sarah, and a smile curved her lips. "Excellent. Miss Bennett is here too. This will make things more efficient." Karim's expression tightened. "Miss Chen, we're in the middle of a private meeting." "Yes, I imagine you're firing her," Victoria said bluntly. "That would be a serious mistake." She turned to Sarah. "Your insights last night were impressive. Not just the content, but the way you presented them. Direct yet diplomatic, innovative yet respectful of tradition. It's exactly what we need in our European division." Sarah's mind struggled to process what was happening as Victoria continued. "I've discussed it with several other board members this morning. We want to offer you a position as Director of Corporate Innovation and Ethics for our European operations." The silence that followed was deafening. Karim's expression had turned to stone, while Sarah felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath her feet. Victoria pulled out a business card and handed it to Sarah. The position would be based in London, overseeing the implementation of new ethical guidelines and sustainable practices across our European markets. "Your salary would be—" She named a figure that made Sarah's eyes widen, plus standard executive benefits, of course. "Ms. Chen," Karim interjected, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "This is highly irregular. Miss Bennett has no executive experience, no formal business education. What she has is vision, integrity, and the courage to speak truth to power," Victoria interrupted. "Those qualities are far rarer and more valuable than an MBA." She turned back to Sarah. "Take the weekend to think about it. My number's on the card. But I should warn you, if you don't take the position, several other companies expressed interest after last night's performance." With that, Victoria left as suddenly as she had arrived, leaving behind a charged atmosphere. Sarah stood frozen, the business card feeling like it was burning a hole in her palm. Karim had moved to stare out the window again, his shoulders rigid with tension. "You may leave now, Miss Bennett," he said finally, his voice cold. "Security will escort you out." Sarah moved toward the door, then paused. "Mr. Al-Rahman," she said softly, "I truly believe in this company's potential. Everything I said last night came from that belief." When he didn't respond, she added, "Thank you for the opportunity to work here. I learned more than you know." As she walked to her desk to collect her belongings, Sarah's mind was spinning. The events of the past 24 hours felt surreal, from being a receptionist to being offered an executive position, from speaking her mind at a high-profile gala to being fired and then immediately presented with an incredible opportunity. Her colleagues watched in confusion as she packed her few personal items into a small box. The security guard who had greeted her every morning for 3 years now stood awkwardly beside her, clearly uncomfortable with his current duty. As she walked through the lobby one last time, Sarah caught her reflection in the polished marble walls. She looked different somehow, stronger, more determined. Outside, the grey morning had given way to weak sunshine breaking through the clouds. Sarah took a deep breath of the crisp air, Victoria Chen's business card secure in her pocket. She had no idea what the future held, but for the first time in her life, she felt ready to embrace the unknown. The price of speaking her truth had been high, but perhaps it was just the beginning of something extraordinary. The London office of Al-Rahman International's European division occupied an entire floor of a sleek glass building in Canary Wharf. Sarah stood in her new office, still struggling to believe that this space, with its panoramic view of the Thames and modern furnishings, was now hers. 3 weeks had passed since that fateful morning in Karim's office, and her life had transformed completely. After accepting Victoria Chen's offer, everything had moved at lightning speed. The contract negotiations, the relocation package, the crash course in corporate protocols, it all felt like a whirlwind. Now facing her first day as Director of Corporate Innovation and Ethics, Sarah felt the full weight of the challenge ahead. "Miss Bennett?" Her new assistant James appeared at the door. "The executive team is gathering for your introductory meeting in the main conference room." Sarah smoothed her tailored navy suit and followed James through the office. She could feel the curious stares of her new colleagues, could hear the whispers. The story of her rise from receptionist to executive had already become company legend. though she suspected the versions circulating weren't entirely accurate. The conference room was filled with faces she recognized from her preparation files. Marcus Thompson, the finance director, a veteran of 20 years with the company. Elena Rodriguez, head of operations, known for her brilliant strategic mind, and several others, all watching her with varying degrees of skepticism and curiosity. "Good morning," Sarah began, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "I know my appointment comes as a surprise to many of you. I won't pretend otherwise. But I'm here because I believe in this company's potential to be better, to lead by example in corporate ethics and sustainable practices." She moved to the presentation screen, bringing up the preliminary strategy she had developed. "In the past month, I've reviewed our current operations extensively. We have significant opportunities for improvement, but also serious challenges to address." As she outlined her vision, Sarah could see the room dividing. Some executives leaned forward, engaged and interested, while others sat back with crossed arms and frowns. Marcus Thompson, in particular, seemed to radiate disapproval. "With all due respect, Miss Bennett," he interrupted, his British accent clipped, "these proposals would require significant restructuring of systems that have been in place for decades. The cost alone would be offset by the long-term benefits," Sarah completed firmly. "The market is changing, Mr. Thompson. Companies that don't adapt to ethical and sustainable practices will be left behind. We're already seeing the consequences of our outdated approaches in our declining market share." Elena Rodriguez nodded slowly. "She has a point. Our latest market analysis shows increasing consumer demand for transparent and sustainable business practices." The discussion continued, growing more heated as various executives defended their positions. Sarah held her ground, drawing on her years of quiet observation and recent intensive study. She knew she needed to establish her authority while also showing respect for their experience. The meeting was interrupted by an unexpected visitor. Karim al-Rahman himself walked into the conference room, causing an immediate hush to fall over the group. Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't seen him since the day he fired her. "Please continue," Karim said, taking a seat at the back of the room. His expression was unreadable as ever, but his presence added an extra layer of tension to the already charged atmosphere. Sarah took a deep breath and pressed on, outlining her proposed changes for ethical supplier verification, sustainable resource management, and transparent reporting systems. She could feel Karim's eyes on her throughout the presentation, but she refused to let his presence shake her confidence. As the meeting concluded, the executives filed out, many stopping to share their thoughts or schedule follow-up discussions. Sarah noticed that despite their initial skepticism, several seemed genuinely interested in her ideas. Even Marcus Thompson grudgingly admitted that some of her proposals merited further consideration. Finally, only Sarah and Karim remained in the conference room. He stood by the window, looking out at the London skyline reminiscent of their last encounter in his office. "Impressive presentation, Miss Bennett," he said finally, still not looking at her, though perhaps a bit ambitious for someone's first week. "Thank you, Mr. Al-Rahman," Sarah replied carefully. "But I believe ambition is exactly what the company needs right now." He turned to face her then, and she was surprised to see a hint of amusement in his eyes. "Indeed, though you should know that your proposals have already created quite a stir at headquarters. The traditional faction of the board is concerned about the pace and scope of your suggested changes." "Change is never comfortable," Sarah acknowledged, "but sometimes it's necessary for survival." "Yes," Karim agreed, studying her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. "Though, I wonder if you truly understand what you're up against. The corporate world can be far more ruthless than you imagine." Before Sarah could respond, his phone buzzed. Checking it, his expression hardened. "It seems your first real test has arrived sooner than expected. One of our major suppliers in Asia has been accused of serious ethical violations. The board is meeting in Dubai tomorrow to discuss our response. You will attend." With that, he strode out of the conference room, leaving Sarah to process this new development. She walked back to her office, her mind already racing with preparations for tomorrow's meeting. As she began researching the supplier situation, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a test. It was a chance to prove that her vision for the company wasn't just idealistic talk. Looking out at the London sunset, Sarah realized that her journey from receptionist to executive was only the beginning. The real challenges, and perhaps the real opportunities, were just starting to unfold. The scorching Dubai sun beat down on Sarah as she stepped out of the air-conditioned limousine and into the opulent lobby of Al Rahman International's Middle Eastern headquarters. The stark contrast between the ultra-modern skyscraper and the ancient desert surrounding it seemed to embody the very conflict she was here to address: tradition versus progress, old ways versus new. As she was escorted to the top-floor boardroom, Sarah mentally reviewed the facts of the case. Gen Manufacturing, one of their largest suppliers in Asia, had been accused of using forced labor in their factories. The evidence was damning: undercover footage, testimonies from former employees, and financial records that didn't add up. The revelation had sent shockwaves through the business world, and Al Rahman International was now under intense scrutiny for its association with Gen. The boardroom was already full when Sarah entered. She recognized most of the faces from her briefing files: senior executives, major shareholders, and influential board members. Karim sat at the head of the table, his expression grave. Sarah took her assigned seat, acutely aware of the questioning glances directed her way. "Now that we're all here," Karim began, his voice cutting through the murmur of conversations, "let's address the crisis at hand. Our association with Gen Manufacturing has put us in a precarious position. We need to decide on our course of action immediately." Marcus Thompson, who had flown in from London, was the first to speak. "The most prudent course of action is to distance ourselves from the scandal, while making minimal changes to our operations. We issue a statement expressing our shock at the revelations, promise to investigate, but essentially maintain the status quo until this blows over." Several heads nodded in agreement, but Sarah couldn't stay silent. "With all due respect, Mr. Thompson, that approach is exactly why we're in this situation to begin with. We can't just pay lip service to ethics when it's convenient." "And what would you suggest, Miss Bennett?" asked an older board member, his tone skeptical. "Sever ties with one of our most critical suppliers over allegations that haven't been proven in court." Sarah took a deep breath, fully aware that her next words could make or break her career. "I believe we need to take decisive action. First, we immediately suspend all contracts with Gen Manufacturing pending a full independent investigation. Second, we implement a comprehensive ethical audit of all our suppliers, not just in Asia but globally." The room erupted in a mix of outrage and support. Some executives argued that Sarah's proposal would cripple their supply chain and tank their stock prices. Others, particularly younger board members, voiced support for a strong ethical stance. "What you're proposing is not just costly, it's potentially ruinous," Marcus objected. "We have shareholders to answer to, profit margins to maintain. We also have a moral obligation," Sarah countered, her voice firm. "More than that, we have a long-term business imperative. Consumer trust is eroding. Governments are implementing stricter regulations. If we don't take the lead on ethical practices now, we'll be playing catch-up for years to come, losing market share and talent to more progressive companies." As the debate raged on, Sarah noticed Karim watching her intently. His face betrayed no emotion, but she sensed he was gauging not just her words but her resolve. Suddenly, the boardroom door burst open, and James, Sarah's assistant, rushed in looking flustered. "I apologize for the interruption," he said, handing Sarah a tablet, "but you need to see this immediately." Sarah's eyes widened as she scanned the breaking news article. She stood up, drawing everyone's attention. "I'm sorry, but this changes everything. Gen Manufacturing's CEO has just been arrested. The allegations were true, and they're even worse than we thought. It's not just forced labor. There's evidence of human trafficking, dangerous working conditions, and massive environmental violations." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Sarah continued, her voice steady. "We don't have the luxury of debate anymore. Every minute we delay action is another minute we're complicit. We need to make a stand now." To everyone's surprise, it was Karim who spoke next. "Miss Bennett is right. We've turned a blind eye for too long, prioritizing profits over principles. It ends today." He turned to Sarah. "Present your plan for immediate implementation. We'll work out the details as we go." For the next several hours, the boardroom transformed into a war room. Sarah led the charge, outlining a comprehensive strategy for ethical reform. They drafted statements, began the process of contract terminations, and laid the groundwork for a global supplier audit. As the Dubai night fell, most of the executives had left to put various parts of the plan into action. Sarah found herself alone on the balcony of the boardroom, looking out over the glittering city. She felt exhausted but exhilarated. For the first time since taking this job, she felt like she was truly making a difference. "Quite a view, isn't it?" Karim's voice startled her. He joined her at the railing, his suit jacket off, tie loosened. "You did well today, Sarah." "Better than I expected." "Thank you," she said, trying to read his expression in the dim light. "I know it's a risky move, but I believe it's the right one." Karim nodded slowly. "It is risky. We're going to face significant challenges in the coming months, but I think you're right, it's necessary." He turned to face her fully. "I'll be honest, I had my doubts about you. I thought Victoria Chen was making a mistake. But today you proved me wrong." Sarah felt a warmth spread through her chest at his words. "I appreciate that. I know I have a lot to learn, but I'm committed to seeing this through." "Good," Karim said, a hint of a smile on his face. "Because this is just the beginning. The real work starts tomorrow." As they stood there looking out over the city, Sarah felt a shift in their dynamic. The tension that had existed since her bold speech at the gala was fading, replaced by something like mutual respect. She realized that in facing this crisis together, they had forged an unexpected alliance. The challenges ahead were daunting, but for the first time Sarah felt truly confident in her ability to meet them. As the cool desert night settled around them, she allowed herself a moment of quiet pride. She had taken a stand for what she believed in, and in doing so had begun to reshape the very foundation of Al Rahman International. The journey ahead would be difficult, but Sarah Bennett was ready to face whatever storms might come. 3 months had passed since the fateful board meeting in Dubai, and Al Rahman International was in the midst of its most significant transformation in decades. Sarah's office in London had become the epicenter of the company's ethical reform movement, a hub of frenetic activity as teams worked tirelessly to implement the new policies and procedures. The initial fallout from their decision to cut ties with Gen Manufacturing had been severe. Stock prices had plummeted, and several major clients had threatened to take their business elsewhere. But as the dust settled, something unexpected began to happen. Ethical investment firms started taking notice. Younger consumers, particularly in Europe and North America, began showing a marked preference for Al Rahman's products. Slowly but surely, the tide was turning. Sarah stood at her office window, watching the sun rise over the Thames. She had barely slept in weeks, but the adrenaline of what they were achieving kept her going. Her phone buzzed. Another message from Karim. Since Dubai, their communication had become frequent and direct. She found herself increasingly relying on his experience and insight, while he seemed to value her fresh perspective and unwavering commitment to their new direction. "Good morning, Mr. Al Rahman," she answered, stifling a yawn. "Sarah," his voice carried a note of urgency, "I need you in Riyadh immediately. There's a situation with our solar energy project." Within hours, Sarah was on a private jet bound for Saudi Arabia. As she reviewed the briefing documents, her concern grew. The solar project was meant to be a cornerstone of their new sustainable energy initiative, a symbol of Al Rahman's commitment to environmental responsibility. But local authorities were threatening to shut it down, citing regulatory issues and pressure from oil industry lobbyists. The Riyadh office was a hive of activity when she arrived. Karim met her at the door, looking as impeccable as ever, despite the clear stress in his eyes. "We have a meeting with the energy minister in an hour," he said, guiding her to a conference room. "We need to convince him that this project is in the country's best interest." As they prepared their strategy, Sarah could feel the weight of what was at stake. This wasn't just about one project, it was about setting a precedent for sustainable development in a region historically dependent on oil. The meeting with the energy minister was tense from the start. The older man seemed skeptical of Sarah's presence, directing most of his comments to Karim. But as Sarah began to present their case, outlining the economic benefits, job creation potential, and positive international press the project would bring, she could see the minister's interest growing. "Your passion is admirable, Miss Bennett," the minister said, leaning back in his chair, But passion doesn't change decades of established industry. No, sir, Sarah agreed, but vision does. This project isn't just about energy, it's about positioning Saudi Arabia as a leader in the global transition to sustainable technologies. It's about securing your country's economic future beyond oil. As she spoke, Sarah could see Karim watching her with a mixture of admiration and something else she couldn't quite define. The meeting stretched on for hours, a delicate dance of negotiation and persuasion. By the end, the minister hadn't given them a definitive answer, but he promised to review their proposal in detail. As they left the ministry building, Karim surprised Sarah by suggesting they take a walk through a nearby park. The Riyadh evening was cooling rapidly, a welcome relief from the day's heat. "You were impressive in there," Karim said, as they strolled along a tree-lined path. "You're becoming quite the diplomat." Sarah smiled, feeling a warmth that had nothing to do with the climate. "I had a good teacher. Your handling of the minister's concerns about job displacement was masterful." They walked in companionable silence for a while, the tension of the day slowly easing. Sarah found herself studying Karim's profile in the fading light. She had to admit, there was something undeniably attractive about him, not just his physical appearance but the strength and intelligence he exuded. "Sarah," Karim said suddenly, stopping to face her, "I owe you an apology." Surprised, Sarah raised an eyebrow. "For what?" "For underestimating you. For dismissing you when you first spoke up at that gala. I was wrong, and the company is better for it." The sincerity in his voice touched her deeply. "Thank you, Karim. That means a lot coming from you." Their eyes met, and for a moment, Sarah felt a spark of something more than professional respect pass between them. But before either could speak, Karim's phone rang, shattering the moment. His expression turned serious as he listened to the caller. "I understand, we'll be right there." "What's wrong?" Sarah asked as they hurried back to the car. "The minister has called an emergency meeting. Apparently, the oil lobbyists have made a counteroffer. We need to get back to the office and prepare." As they raced through the Riyadh night, Sarah's mind was already formulating strategies. She knew they were facing an uphill battle, but she was determined to see this through. The solar project wasn't just about business anymore. It had become a symbol of everything they were fighting for. In the car, Sarah felt Karim's hand briefly cover hers. "Whatever happens," he said softly, "I want you to know that I'm glad you're here. We make a good team." Sarah nodded, feeling a mix of emotions she wasn't quite ready to examine. As the lights of the city rushed by, she steeled herself for the challenge ahead. The winds of change were blowing through Al Rahman International, and Sarah Bennett was at the heart of the storm. The following weeks were a whirlwind of negotiations, presentations, and late-night strategy sessions. Sarah and Karim had practically moved into the Riyadh office, working tirelessly to keep the solar project alive. The opposition from oil industry lobbyists was fierce, but they were making progress, slowly winning over key decision-makers with their vision of a sustainable future for Saudi Arabia. It was during one of these marathon work sessions that Sarah first noticed the change in the air. The sky outside the office windows had taken on an ominous orange hue, and the wind was picking up, whistling around the corners of the building. "Sandstorm," Karim said, noticing her concerned glance. "It's not uncommon this time of year. We should wrap up soon and head to the hotel before it gets worse." But as they were packing up their materials, Karim's phone rang. His expression darkened as he listened to the caller. "I understand. We'll be there as soon as we can." "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, recognizing the tension in his voice. "The energy minister wants to meet with us. Now. He says he's made his decision about the project." Sarah's heart raced. This could be the moment that determined the fate of everything they'd been working towards. As they hurried to the car, the wind was howling, sand already beginning to obscure their vision. The drive to the ministry was treacherous. Their driver, Ahmed, struggled to keep the vehicle on the road as the storm intensified. By the time they arrived, the world outside was a swirling mass of sand and wind. The energy minister met them in his office, his face grave. "Mr. Al-Rahman, Miss Bennett, I apologize for the urgent summons, but I felt this couldn't wait. I've reviewed all the proposals, and I've made my decision." Sarah held her breath, feeling Karim tense beside her. "I'm approving the solar project," the minister said, and Sarah felt a surge of elation, but it was short-lived. "However," he continued, "there are conditions. The scale must be reduced by 30%, and a significant portion of the contracts must go to local companies, many of which have ties to the oil industry. Karim started to protest, but Sarah placed a hand on his arm, silencing him. She could see that this was a delicate moment, a test of their ability to compromise without sacrificing the essence of their vision. "Minister," she said carefully, "we appreciate your support of the project. Could we perhaps discuss these conditions in more detail? I believe we can find a way to address your concerns while maintaining the project's viability and impact." The next hour was an intense negotiation. Sarah drew on every ounce of her diplomatic skills, finding creative solutions to bridge the gap between the minister's demands and their goals. Karim, following her lead, offered key concessions while holding firm on the most critical aspects of the project. As they finally reached an agreement, a loud crash from outside startled them. The storm had intensified to dangerous levels. "It's not safe to travel now," the minister said, looking concerned. "You'll have to stay here until it passes. It could be hours." And so Sarah and Karim found themselves sequestered in a small conference room as the sandstorm raged outside. The building's backup generators hummed in the background, keeping the lights on as the main power flickered and died. In this forced intimacy, with the world beyond reduced to a howling brown haze, the dynamic between them began to shift. Karim, usually so composed, seemed restless, pacing the small room. "Are you all right?" Sarah asked, genuinely concerned. Karim paused, running a hand through his hair. "I've never liked storms," he admitted. "Too unpredictable, too beyond our control." Sarah was struck by this glimpse of vulnerability from a man who always seemed so unshakable. "Sometimes the things beyond our control lead to the most important changes," she said softly. He turned to look at her, really look at her, perhaps for the first time. Like a receptionist speaking up at a gala and changing the course of a company. Sarah felt a blush creep up her cheeks. "Or a CEO willing to listen and embrace that change," she countered. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken tension. Karim moved closer, his dark eyes intense. "Sarah, But before he could finish, the lights flickered violently and went out completely, plunging them into darkness. Sarah felt Karim's hand find hers in the dark, a steadying presence. As their eyes adjusted to the dim emergency lighting, Sarah became acutely aware of how close they were standing. The howling wind outside, the darkness, the intensity of the day's events, it all combined to create a moment of suspended reality. "Karim," Sarah whispered, her heart pounding. "What's happening here? Between us?" He was silent for a long moment, his thumb tracing small circles on her hand. "I don't know," he finally said, his voice low. "But I think it's something we need to be careful with. There's so much at stake." Sarah nodded, knowing he was right. Their professional relationship, the future of the company, the success of their vision, it was all hanging in a delicate balance. And yet, she couldn't deny the pull she felt towards him. The connection that had been building over months of shared challenges and triumphs. As they stood there in the semi-darkness, the storm raging around them, Sarah realized that they were at a crossroads. Whatever happened next would irrevocably change the dynamic between them, for better or for worse. The sandstorm outside was reshaping the landscape, just as the metaphorical storm they had unleashed was reshaping Al Rahman International. And in this small room, isolated from the world, Sarah and Karim faced their own personal tempest, one that had the power to transform them both. As dawn broke over Riyadh, the sandstorm finally began to subside. Sarah and Karim emerged from the ministry building, blinking in the harsh sunlight that now pierced through the dissipating haze. The city looked different somehow, as if the storm had swept away more than just sand and debris. The drive back to their hotel was quiet, both lost in thought about the events of the night before. The intensity of their shared moment in the darkness lingered between them, unspoken but palpable. "We should get some rest," Karim said as they reached the hotel lobby. "We have a lot of work ahead of us to implement the new agreement." Sarah nodded, feeling the weight of exhaustion settle over her. "You're right. We'll regroup later." "Of course," he replied, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "We have much to discuss." In her room, Sarah found sleep elusive despite her fatigue. Her mind raced with thoughts of the project, the negotiation's success, and most persistently, Karim. The connection between them had been building for months, but last night had brought it into sharp focus. She knew they were treading dangerous ground. Office romances were complicated at the best of times, let alone between a CEO and a newly promoted executive in the midst of a company-wide transformation. Later that afternoon, refreshed but still conflicted, Sarah met Karim in the hotel's private conference room. They had work to do, plans to make for the solar project's next steps. But as soon as the door closed behind them, the professional facade cracked. "Sarah," Karim began, his voice low and serious, "about last night. We should focus on the project," Sarah interrupted, not quite ready to confront the elephant in the room. "We've made incredible progress, but there's still so much to do." Karim nodded, a flicker of something, disappointment, relief, crossing his face. "You're right, of course. Let's review the minister's conditions and plan our next moves." They threw themselves into work, discussing strategies for integrating local companies into the project while maintaining their ethical standards. As they talked, Sarah couldn't help but marvel at how in sync they were, anticipating each other's thoughts and building on each other's ideas. Hours passed, and as the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, they finally paused. Karim walked to the window, gazing out at the city skyline. "We've come so far," he mused. "When you first spoke up at that gala, I never imagined we'd be here." Sarah joined him at the window, careful to maintain a professional distance. "It's been quite a journey," she agreed, "but I believe in what we're doing, Karim. We're changing things for the better." He turned to face her, his expression softening. "We are, and a large part of that is thanks to you, Sarah. Your vision, your determination, you've pushed us all to be better." The air between them seemed to crackle with unspoken tension. Sarah knew they were approaching a precipice, a point of no return. "Karim, we need to talk about what's happening between us," she said softly. He nodded, taking a deep breath. "I know, Sarah, But before he could continue, a sharp knock at the door interrupted them. James, Sarah's assistant, burst in, looking flustered. "I'm sorry to interrupt, but you need to see this immediately," he said, handing Sarah a tablet. Sarah's eyes widened as she scanned the screen. "Oh no," she breathed. "What is it?" Karim asked, moving closer to read over her shoulder. "There's been a leak," Sarah explained, her voice tight. "Someone has released confidential documents detailing some of the company's past unethical practices. It's all over the news." Karim's face darkened. "How recent are these documents?" "They're from before our reforms," Sarah said, scrolling through the article. "But they're damning, Karim. Bribes, environmental violations, labor abuses, it's all here." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. All their hard work, all the progress they'd made, it was now at risk of being overshadowed by these revelations from the company's past. "We need to get ahead of this," Karim said, his CEO persona snapping back into place. "Sarah, call the PR team. We need a statement prepared immediately. I'll contact the board." As they sprang into action, the moment of personal connection between them evaporated, replaced by the urgency of crisis management. But as Sarah dialed the PR team, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this leak than met the eye. Who had access to these documents? Why release them now, just as they were making real progress on their ethical reforms? And most troublingly, why did some of the information in the leak seem familiar to her? As the night wore on and they worked tirelessly to control the damage, Sarah's mind kept returning to a disturbing thought. She had seen some of these documents before, weeks ago, in an anonymous email she had dismissed as a prank. Could she have prevented this if she'd taken it more seriously? The crisis was far from over, but as Sarah watched Karim fielding calls from angry board members and concerned investors, she realized that their relationship, whatever it was becoming, would have to wait. The company they had worked so hard to transform was under threat, and they needed to stand united against the storm that was about to break. Little did they know, this leak was just the beginning. The sands were shifting beneath their feet, and the true test of their leadership and their bond was yet to come. The days following the leak were a blur of crisis management meetings, press conferences, and damage control efforts. Sarah and Karim had barely slept, working around the clock to address the fallout from the revelations. They had returned to London, where the company's main PR team was based, to better coordinate their response. As Sarah entered the conference room for yet another emergency meeting, She couldn't help but feel the weight of guilt pressing down on her. She still hadn't told Karim about the anonymous email she had received weeks ago. Every time she thought about bringing it up, the moment never seemed right, and now it felt like too much time had passed. Karim was already in the room, looking as impeccable as ever despite the stress of the past few days. But Sarah could see the toll it was taking on him in the tightness around his eyes and the set of his jaw. "Good morning," he said, his voice tired but determined. "We've got a lot to cover today. The board is demanding answers, and we need to reassure our investors before the stock price drops any further." As they dove into the meeting, discussing strategies and reviewing the latest media coverage, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something. The leak was too well timed, too carefully crafted to be a coincidence. "Karim," she said during a lull in the conversation, "have we considered the possibility that this leak was an inside job?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning to her. Karim's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" Sarah took a deep breath, knowing she needed to tread carefully. The documents that were leaked, they're not just random files. They're curated to paint the worst possible picture of the company's past practices. Someone with intimate knowledge of our history put this together. Marcus Thompson, who had flown in from the Middle East office, scoffed. "Are you suggesting one of us is responsible for this mess?" "Not necessarily," Sarah replied, meeting his skeptical gaze. "But I think we need to consider all possibilities. This leak came at a very convenient time for anyone who might want to derail our ethical reforms." Karim nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "You may be right. We've certainly made some powerful enemies with our recent changes." He turned to the head of security. "I want a full internal investigation quietly. We need to know who had access to these documents and who might have motive to release them." As the meeting wrapped up and people began to file out, Karim caught Sarah's arm. "A word in private, please." Once they were alone, Karim's professional demeanor softened slightly. "Sarah, you look exhausted. Are you all right?" The concern in his voice nearly broke her resolve. She wanted to confide in him, to share the burden of her guilt over the email. But before she could speak, he continued. "I need you to know that I trust you completely," he said, his dark eyes intense. "In all of this chaos, you're the one person I know I can rely on." Sarah felt her heart constrict. How could she tell him now that she might have had a chance to prevent this crisis? "Karim, But once again they were interrupted. James burst into the room, his face pale. "I'm sorry, but you need to see this immediately," he said, turning on the large screen on the wall. The news channel was running breaking news. A reporter stood outside Al Rahman International's Dubai office, looking grim. Sources close to the company have revealed that the recent ethical violations were not isolated incidents, but part of a systematic cover-up orchestrated by top executives. We've been told that evidence points to the involvement of CEO Karim Al-Rahman himself. The room seemed to spin around Sarah. She looked at Karim, expecting to see shock or outrage. Instead, his face was a mask of resigned sadness. "Karim?" she whispered, suddenly unsure of everything she thought she knew. He met her gaze, his eyes full of an emotion she couldn't quite decipher. "Sarah, I need you to listen to me very carefully. Things are about to get much worse, and I need to know if I can trust you completely." "Of course," she replied automatically, even as her mind raced with questions. Karim took a deep breath. "What I'm about to tell you, it could change everything. But before I do, I need you to be honest with me. Is there anything at all that you haven't told me about this situation?" The moment of truth arrived. Sarah felt as if she was standing on the edge of a precipice, knowing that her next words would determine the course of everything to come. The weight of her secret pressed against her chest, demanding to be released. "Karim," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "there's something I need to tell you." As Sarah prepared to confess about the anonymous email, the tension in the room was palpable. Outside, the London sky darkened as storm clouds gathered, mirroring the turmoil within. They stood at the eye of a storm that threatened to tear apart everything they had built together, personally and professionally. The truth, whatever it might be, was about to come to light, and nothing would ever be the same again. Sarah's heart pounded as she met Karim's intense gaze. "I received an anonymous email a few weeks ago," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "It contained some of the documents that were leaked. I dismissed it as a prank. I should have taken it more seriously. I'm so sorry, Karim." For a moment, silence hung heavy in the room. Karim's expression was unreadable, and Sarah felt as if the ground might open up beneath her feet. Then, unexpectedly, Karim let out a deep sigh of relief. "Thank you for your honesty, Sarah. I suspected as much." Confusion washed over her. "You knew?" Karim nodded, his shoulders sagging slightly. "I had my suspicions. The timing was too convenient, but I needed to hear it from you." Before Sarah could respond, Karim continued, his voice low and urgent. "What I'm about to tell you goes deeper than you can imagine. The leak, the accusations against me, it's all part of a bigger plan." Over the next hour, Karim revealed a tale that seemed almost too incredible to believe. For years, a faction within the company had been resisting any attempts at ethical reform, fearing it would cut into their profits. When Karim had started pushing for change, they had begun plotting against him. "The documents in the leak are real," Karim admitted, "but they're from before I became CEO. I inherited a company with deep-rooted issues, and I've been working to change it from the inside. That's why I brought you in, Sarah. I needed someone with fresh eyes, someone who wouldn't be afraid to challenge the status quo." Sarah's mind reeled as she processed this information. "But why not come clean about all of this from the beginning?" "Because I needed proof," Karim explained. "I've been gathering evidence, building a case against the real perpetrators, but they moved faster than I anticipated." As they talked, piecing together the puzzle, a plan began to form. They would need to act quickly, decisively, and most importantly, together. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of activity. Sarah and Karim worked tirelessly, coordinating with trusted allies within the company and outside investigators. They combed through years of financial records, emails, and meeting minutes, building an ironclad case against the corrupt faction. As dawn broke on the second day, they were ready. Karim called an emergency board meeting, and Sarah stood by his side as he laid out the truth. The room erupted into chaos as accusations flew and long-held secrets came to light. In the end, it was Sarah who silenced the room. "Gentlemen," she said, her voice clear and confident, "we have a choice to make. We can continue down this path of deception and greed, or we can embrace the change that's long overdue. Al-Rahman International has the potential to be a leader in ethical business practices. The question is, are you brave enough to make that happen?" Her words seemed to hang in the air, and for a moment, Sarah feared they had failed. But then, one by one, board members began to nod. The tide was turning. In the weeks that followed, Al-Rahman International underwent a massive restructuring. The corrupt executives were removed, and new, ethically minded leaders were brought in. Sarah found herself at the forefront of this change, working alongside Karim to implement the reforms they had long envisioned. The media storm gradually subsided as the full story came to light. Al-Rahman International's transparency in addressing its past mistakes and its commitment to future ethical practices began to restore public trust. The solar project in Saudi Arabia, momentarily forgotten in the chaos, was back on track and gaining international attention as a model of sustainable development in the region. As the dust settled, Sarah found herself once again standing beside Karim, looking out over the London skyline from his office. The city below seemed different somehow, full of new possibilities. "We did it," she said softly, still hardly believing it herself. Karim turned to her, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "We did, but it's only the beginning, Sarah. There's still so much work to do." She met his gaze, feeling the now familiar flutter in her chest. "Together?" His hand found hers, their fingers intertwining. "Together," he agreed. As they stood there, the setting sun painting the sky in brilliant hues, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought them to this point. From a chance encounter at a gala to weathering the storm of corporate intrigue, they had forged a partnership that transcended the professional realm. The challenges ahead were numerous, but Sarah felt ready to face them. With Karim by her side and the support of a newly invigorated company behind them, she knew they could make a real difference in the world of business ethics. As night fell over London, Sarah and Karim left the office hand in hand, ready to write the next chapter of their story, both personal and professional, together.